Consider January 1949. America felt settled, with life having resumed its regular rhythm. Farms were operational, towns were expanding, and winter was merely another season. People believed they understood their world. Cars were substantial, roads narrow. There was the morning newspaper, the radio, and the outdoor weather. Winter began predictably, with snow in the forecast and cold temperatures. Nothing unusual for January across Nebraska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. People fed livestock before dawn, children bundled up for school, and engines grumbled to life without haste or absence from routines. They had seen snow countless times. However, this winter differed. It didn't strike suddenly, but gradually intensified. Snow fell and remained, wind sculpting it into towering walls that surpassed trains and engines. Roads disappeared, familiar landmarks vanished, and towns grew silent as farms became isolated enclaves. Some families spent nearly a month without seeing another person. A widespread realization dawned across the plains. This was no longer just a storm, but a state of confinement, isolation, and a struggle for survival. This narrative recounts the blizzard of 1949, the winter that entombed the heart of America, a tempest later dubbed the storm of the century. Please subscribe and like the video to help us reach a wider audience. Thank you. New Year's Day 1949 brought pleasant conditions to much of Wyoming. Temperatures were moderate for early January. Families visited neighbors, ranchers calmly attended to their herds, and children played in already fallen snow, unaware of the immense quantities yet to come. The forecast for January 1st predicted partly cloudy skies, highs in the 30s, and a chance of snow flurries in the mountains. This was the radio's message, and people believed it. By Sunday afternoon, the situation drastically altered. An Arctic cold front swept in unexpectedly from Canada, colliding with moisture-laden air ascending from the south. This confluence produced a phenomenon the Weather Bureau had not foreseen, one their instruments failed to detect. A colossal winter system that would not merely pass through. Heavy snow began to fall across eastern Wyoming, western Nebraska, and the Dakotas. The wind started to howl, and temperatures plummeted. Individuals who had driven to neighbors' homes that afternoon found themselves stranded. Families attending church discovered roads impassable before services concluded. Ranchers who had checked cattle in the morning could not locate their barns by evening. One could stand on their porch and barely discern their fence line a mere 50 feet away. The ceaseless wind propelled both fresh and accumulated snow sideways with such intensity it felt like sandblasting. This was not the gentle, picturesque snowfall typically associated with winter. The snow during the 1949 blizzard was uniquely cold, preventing it from clumping like ordinary snow. It was a fine powder that permeated every crevice and structures, accumulating inside barns, granaries, and attics, driven by relentless gusts. The initial storm abated only on Wednesday, January 5th, leaving behind substantial damage. Yet, what distinguished 1949 from all preceding and subsequent blizzards was its protracted nature. It wasn't a single event, but weeks of storms, wave after wave sweeping across the northern plains from early January through mid-February. The wind scarcely ceased. As one system departed, another formed. Snow persisted, drifts grew, and temperatures remained brutally cold. Some regions were buried under snow for nearly 2 months, marking this event as exceptional. Its defining characteristic was not the ferocity of one storm, but its unyielding duration. The continuous accumulation and its relentless succession, day after day, week after week, until people questioned if it would ever end. A solitary blizzard tests resilience. One hunkers down, endures, digs out, and moves on. But when storms are incessant, snow piles endlessly, roads remain buried, and external contact is severed. A transformation occurs. Survival transcends merely weathering a storm. It becomes an immersion into the profound meaning of isolation. The drifts that formed during those weeks were not measured in inches, but in stories, some exceeding 20 feet in height, compacted by the wind to concrete-like hardness. In certain areas, dynamite was necessary to clear them. The wind did not uniformly distribute the snow, rather, it sculpted it. One spot might be swept completely bare, revealing frozen ground, while at 100 yards distant, a drift could engulf a 2-story barn to its roofline. Roads utterly vanished, not merely covered, but erased. Drivers could not distinguish between the highway and the fields. The snow filled every cut, dip, and low spot, burying signs, fences, and abandoned cars. Trains along the Union Pacific and Burlington lines were swallowed by drifts. Locomotives halted as snow filled railway cuts faster than rotary plows could clear them. Passenger trains, carrying hundreds, became marooned in small towns unaccustomed to such crowds. In Egbert, Wyoming, a town of 60 residents, nearly 1,000 passengers from stranded trains had to be evacuated from their frozen carriages. Women and children were directed to the cramped train depot, while others trudged through waist-high drifts and 50-mile-per-hour winds to reach a schoolhouse 4 blocks away. Most were unprepared, having boarded in Chicago expecting to reach San Francisco, packing for California, not for survival. One passenger likened the ordeal to imprisonment, deeming it worse than anything he had previously endured. The railroads incurred millions in losses. At one point, over 50 trains were stalled across the region. Passenger trains, with hundreds of occupants, were stranded for days. In one instance, a freight train laden with food was stranded alongside passenger cars. Railroad workers ransacked the cargo for eggs, ham, bacon, and lettuce to feed the starving passengers. When heating systems failed and temperatures inside cars plummeted to 10 degrees above zero, passengers had to be evacuated on foot through the snow. Yet, trains possessed metal walls and sometimes functional heaters, and their crews could radio for assistance. Imagine being alone on a ranch 40 miles from town, a reality hundreds of families faced during the 1949 blizzard. The isolation initially crept in. On the first day, one assumed the storm would pass. On the second, doubts stirred. By the third, it was clear no help was coming. Roads were obliterated. Telephone lines were down. The sole link to the outside world was a battery-powered radio, which only confirmed that everyone else was equally trapped. Families living 5 miles apart remained cut off for weeks. Some ranches were isolated for 6 weeks, others for 9. A woman in northeastern Wyoming meticulously recorded her family's 9-week snow captivity before rescue could reach them. 9 weeks, nearly 2 months, without contact with anyone outside the immediate family, without fresh supplies, without news save for radio broadcasts, without certainty of eventual aid. Those who lived through it discovered previously unknown facets of themselves. Each morning began with shoveling, to exit the house, reach the barn, feed animals, access the woodpile or coal bin, find the pump, or simply to survey the world. Then the wind would blow anew, and by evening, everything cleared would be refilled, signaling a repeat performance the next morning. One survivor remarked that anyone who endured the 1949 blizzard, especially in rural areas, should never again have to shovel snow, having met their lifetime quota in those few weeks. Ranchers suffered the most. Their livelihood, their livestock, was perishing. Cattle and sheep are typically resilient to normal winters, built for such conditions. But this was unprecedented. The snow buried their necessary grazing grass. Wind drove ice into their eyes and nostrils. The cold penetrated even the thickest hides. Some animals suffocated as fine, hard snow packed into their noses and froze, cutting off their air supply. Others simply froze in place, too exhausted to move, too weak to seek shelter. Ranchers found cattle frozen solid and upright, icicles dangling from their chins to the ground, requiring axes to dislodge them. Official estimates cited tens of thousands of cattle, and even more sheep, lost across Wyoming and neighboring states. Yet ranchers knew these figures were understated. The true toll would not be revealed until spring, when the drifts finally melted, uncovering what lay beneath. One rancher, peering out his window during the storm, mistook a frozen horse for a sculpture. So realistic and perfectly formed it appeared. It was, in fact, a horse, frozen solid, still standing. Keeping animals alive became an obsession. Ranchers, unable to reach their herds by ground, attempted every conceivable method. Some hitched horses to sleds, battling through drifts. Others walked for miles in conditions lethal to the unprepared within hours. Upon finally reaching their livestock, the animals were often beyond saving, starving, frozen, huddled in corners seeking warmth, only to be buried by drifting snow. The loss was not merely financial. These ranchers had raised and known these animals intimately, having given birth to calves in the spring and nurtured their growth. They now discovered them lifeless, sometimes by the dozens. One woman recounted observing her husband's return after inspecting the herd. He uttered no words. His gaze alone conveyed everything. Within their homes, survival manifested in diverse ways. Families who endured were those who had prepared. Not because they foresaw the impending storm, but because readiness for harsh winters was an inherent part of life on the northern plains. Cellars brimming with preserved vegetables, homemade canned meats and fruits, grains stored for livestock, and flour for the family were commonplace. Most ranching households were self-sufficient, out of necessity. The nearest town might be 30 miles distant on a fortunate day. They had learned to procure necessities before they were needed. Yet even the most rigorously prepared families felt the strain as the week prolonged. Supplies intended for a month were stretched to 2 or 3. Fresh provisions depleted first, followed by treats, until options dwindled and meals became mere sustenance. The same fare daily, just enough to persist. Some families experienced heating fuel shortages, resorting to burning furniture for warmth. They closed off room after room, retreating to the kitchen, the sole space they could maintain above freezing. Blankets adorned doorways, and they slept in shifts, someone invariably monitoring the stove. Their homes were not constructed like contemporary residences. Insulation was minimal, and wind infiltrated every crevice. One man remarked that a bushel of snow could penetrate a nail hole during those weeks, a slight exaggeration. In certain dwellings, snow drifted through wooden shingles on the roof, accumulating in the attic, only to melt from the rising heat below, causing ceilings to collapse and water damage to spread. The cold itself was uncompromising. Temperatures plunged to 20, 30, even 40 degrees below zero. The wind exacerbated conditions, bringing wind chills that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. One family described their heating stove glowing red hot, too scorching to touch, yet failing to adequately warm the house. They consumed meals standing around it, as it was the only place they weren't shivering. Children slept in lofts, separated from 40 below temperatures by only a thin board and hand-hewn shingles. Nevertheless, spirits somehow remained resilient. Children perceived this period differently than adults, regarding it as the adventure of a lifetime. Schools closed, not just for a day or a week, but some for 6 weeks or more. The University of Wyoming canceled classes, an almost unprecedented occurrence. For children who had never known hills for sledding, as the terrain was flat as a tabletop, drifts suddenly soared 15 feet high in their backyards. They could ascend barn roofs and leap into snow so deep they vanished, construct tunnels, snow forts, and entire white villages. One child recalled walking on drifts so dense and firm that one could traverse them without sinking, walking atop fences, atop cars. An entire world transformed into something magical, something that would never recur. Adults observed their children at play, experiencing simultaneous emotions. Gratitude that the youngsters found joy amidst adversity, and dread that the children failed to grasp the true gravity of the situation. For people perished in the blizzard of 1949. Not many, considering the scope of the calamity, but enough. Some died in their vehicles, stranded on roads that had disappeared. They sat with engines running until fuel ran out, then froze in their seats. Others attempted to walk to safety, but never succeeded. One family's narrative became a poignant emblem of the blizzard's ruthlessness. They had visited neighbors on a Sunday afternoon. When the storm struck, they decided to endeavor a return home. Their pickup became stuck 3/4 of a mile from their residence. Initially, they remained in the truck, awaiting the storm's abatement, but it persisted and grew colder. Finally, they opted to walk, accompanied by 2 young children. The parents attempted to hold up a blanket to shield the children from the wind as they walked behind it. However, the children could not maintain pace. The cold was too intense. When rescuers discovered them, the mother was frozen on her knee, reaching down to pick up her small daughter. The father was frozen, attempting to support his son. By winter's end, dozens across the plains had succumbed. Some in cars, some on foot. Some simply caught in the wrong location when the wind obliterated the road beneath them. The neighbors who had walked with them survived, but that family did not. Such accounts circulated throughout the plains, reminding everyone that this was no adventure, no mere snow day. It was a matter of life and death, decided by split-second decisions. By late January, the situation had grown so precarious that federal intervention became necessary. On January 29th, President Truman declared the region a major disaster area, entrusting command of relief operations to Major General Lewis Pick of the Army Corps of Engineers, with a clear and direct mandate: dig out the West. Operation Snowbound commenced, becoming the largest peacetime snow removal operation in American history. Army, Navy, Air Force, National Guard, and private contractors converged on the northern plains with every available piece of equipment: bulldozers, snowplows, tracked vehicles called weasels capable of traversing packed drifts. Sherman tanks were deployed when nothing else could penetrate. The operation spanned 4 states and nearly 200,000 square miles, an area the size of Spain. Convoys of vehicles followed bulldozers north, south, east, and west, carving through drifts that had isolated entire counties. Upon reaching remote ranches, they found inhabitants who had not seen outsiders for weeks. Some families wept at the sight of the vehicles. Others merely stared, barely able to process that the siege was finally lifting. The military delivered more than just plows. They brought food, medicine, and feed for the surviving livestock. And they brought pilots. The Civil Air Patrol, a volunteer auxiliary of the Air Force, conducted hundreds of missions over the snowbound region. Small planes equipped with skis took off from cleared roads, soaring over the white expanse, searching for signs of life. Families in need of assistance were instructed to leave coded messages in the snow. Various patterns conveyed different meanings: need food, need medicine, need a doctor. Pilots identified the messages and reported back, and supplies were coordinated. Some drops were made directly onto the snow: hay bales for starving cattle, food packages for isolated families. Bales tumbled from cargo planes, bursting upon impact, scattering feed for animals too weak to travel. One rancher requested a bale be dropped near his house. The pilot complied, and the bale crashed through the roof of his front porch. But it arrived. The Air Force initiated Operation Helilift, dropping tons of feed across the region. Approximately 2 million cattle and sheep received hay from the air before the operation concluded. It wasn't enough to save them all, but it sustained many until ground operations could reach them. On the ground, conditions were equally brutal for rescuers. The wind persisted, snow continued to drift, and the cold penetrated every layer of clothing. 1 soldier and 6 civilians perished during Operation Snowbound, some from frostbite, some from exhaustion, some from the sheer physical toll of battling conditions humans were not meant to endure. Yet, slowly, mile by mile, roads reopened, trains resumed movement, towns reconnected, and ranches were reached. By February 19th, the last major storms had passed, and the weather finally began to improve. Operation Snowbound continued until March 15th, clearing the remaining blocked roads and ensuring no one remained trapped. In Wyoming alone, over 4,000 people received federal aid, and nearly 1,000 ranches were assisted. Snow-moving equipment operated day and night for weeks, logging tens of thousands of continuous work hours. The cost was immense, measured not only in money, but in months of labor, fatigued equipment, and lives permanently altered. However, the cost could not be measured solely in dollars. As the snow melted through March, April, and into May, the full extent of the toll became apparent. Deceased cattle and sheep emerged from gullies and draws where they had sought shelter. Dead wildlife appeared from drifts that had seemed empty. Pockets of antelope were found, one after another, where the animals had huddled and frozen. The red desert antelope herd was almost annihilated. 1,800 antelope were killed by trains along the Union Pacific Main Line alone. The animals had congregated on the cleared tracks, as it was the only place they could escape the snow. When trains finally resumed operation, the antelope had nowhere to go. Pheasant populations in some counties were almost entirely eradicated. Deer herds took years to recover. But spring also brought restoration. The massive snowpack in the mountains gradually melted, replenishing streams and reservoirs. It provided the largest amount of irrigation water Wyoming had seen in years. The ensuing summer was lush and productive, and autumn yielded abundant harvests. The land recovered. The herds were rebuilt. Life continued. Yet those who lived through the blizzard of 1949 were never quite the same. They had gleaned profound insights about themselves and the world they inhabited. They had learned that modern life could still be halted by nature, that roads, trains, telephones, and all the conveniences of the 20th century could be swept away in a matter of hours. They had learned that survival depended on neighbors, on community, on the willingness of strangers to assist strangers when all else failed. Amidst the fiercest gales, societal barriers crumbled. Wealthy and impoverished, ranchers and urban dwellers, government staff and private citizens collaborated seamlessly. When a knock resonated at your entrance during a blizzard, you welcomed the person without question or hesitation. It was an inherent response. As one survivor articulated, everyone was acquainted with everyone else, regardless of the circumstances. If you encountered difficulties, everyone contributed. These were truly good people. Hotels became sanctuaries for stranded travelers, and homes offered refuge to strangers. Some families accommodated so many displaced individuals that they rotated sleeping shifts, yet no one was ever turned away. This is what people recall most vividly decades later. Not the cold, not the snow, not the fear, but the profound kindness. It was a testament to how adversity could elicit humanity's finest qualities, rather than its worst failings. In September 1949, months after the last snowdrift had vanished, workers excavating a utility line made an unexpected discovery. Long after the snow finally receded, traces of that winter still surfaced. Fences lay buried, structures were warped, and the landscape had been reshaped by a season that refused to relinquish its grip. 9 months later, the winter of 1949 still exerted a lingering influence. Such was its intensity and its endurance. The individuals who experienced it are now in their 80s and 90s. While some have passed on, those who remain continue to recount their tales. They speak of leaping from barn roofs into drifts so profound they would disappear from view. They recall sledding on hills that had not existed before the storm and would vanish after the spring thaw. They describe the uncanny beauty of a world transformed into something simultaneously magical and terrifying. They speak of their parents, who toiled ceaselessly to sustain their families. Of fathers who trekked miles through impossible conditions to check on livestock that might already be deceased. Of mothers who conjured meals from almost nothing and upheld spirits when all hope seemed lost. They recount the relentless sound of the wind, howling for days and weeks until the very concept of silence became distant. And they remember the day the snow finally ceased, the sun emerged, and the first vehicle breached the drifts, signaling the arrival of someone from the outside world. Every subsequent storm is measured against 1949, and every one falls short. There has been nothing comparable before, and nothing since. A survivor eloquently put it, "We'll always remember that storm. It stands out among all the other storms we've had, and we managed to live through it. Thank the Lord. We're Wyomingites. We can take it." The blizzard of 1949 did more than just challenge the people of the northern plains. It illuminated their character. It revealed their resilience, their capacity for endurance, and how they treated each other when all else was stripped away. It demonstrated that isolation can be overcome, but only through collective effort. That the harshest winters can be outlasted, but only by refusing to yield. That the land commands respect, yet also rewards those who heed its lessons. The storm of the century concluded in March of 1949, but its memory has persisted for nearly 80 years. And for those who lived through it, for their children who heard the narratives, for their grandchildren who examined the faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, that memory will never completely fade. Some winters merely teach about snow. The winter of 1949 educated a generation about themselves, and that is a lesson that endures eternally.